Welcome everyone to Howling with the Wolfe. Thank you guys for sticking with me. We're a few minutes late. That's on me. But there's a bunch of stuff we want to talk about today. It's the Winless Bowl. If you guys haven't seen, I wrote a story on ESPN.com about the Winless Bowl. It's a very fun but also informative piece on how to look at this game from a Miami Dolphins and a Washington football team perspective, and how these two teams are essentially going through different direction paths on this whole winless journey. So I want to talk a lot about that. I have something different and special for you guys today. I had a conversation with Dolphins center Daniel Kilgore in the locker room today, really informative about his former teammate Colin Kaepernick. And I kind of want to share some of that conversation. I'll probably use some of it for a story that we're doing for ESPN later, but I want to let you guys into sort of the mindset of players, particularly on these topics, which becomes even more important because we saw the statement, for anybody who didn't see, Colin Kaepernick's agent and his team came out with a statement kind of squashing a lot of the preconceived notions that are out about him and that. So I want to discuss that. And then finally, I want to discuss Josh Rosen, who talked this week about feeling like this is a 12-game audition for him, and him being aware of the Tua craze, the Dolphins fan base, and the fact that the Dolphins are likely going to be in the market for a quarterback next draft, and just kind of talk about how all of this is impacting him. So those are the three main topics we're going to talk on Howling with the Wolfe today. And also, I want to get your questions as always. So fire away if you guys have questions. We're going to go ahead and get to the meat. So first things first, I just want to jump into the newest stuff and the most natural stuff, which I mentioned, which was Daniel Kilgore's my conversation with Daniel Kilgore about Colin Kaepernick. And for you guys who don't know, Daniel Kilgore came into the league with Colin Kaepernick in 2011. They played together in the San Francisco 49ers for 6 seasons before Colin Kaepernick eventually was blackballed from the league. So I think that he had a very interesting perspective, particularly as a white male who didn't necessarily have the same understanding or belief system as Colin Kaepernick. So he was really gracious with his time. He's one of the best dudes in the locker room to chat with. So I figured I'd just ask him and see what his thoughts were. And he shared a few things with me that I'm going to share with you. I think first thing first is he talked about just how much of a leader Colin was on the field. And we kind of forget about Colin, the football player, when we go through a lot of these protests elements, and everybody's really divisive on one side or the other, and you have a perspective of either you agree with them or you don't agree with them. Either way, there's sort of you draw your line in the sand. But he was a really good football player. He led the 49ers to a Super Bowl, and I think hearing Daniel Kilgore kind of tell me that he was a vocal leader. He talked about him in the huddle, and how he had such a strong command of the offense, and he talked about that Super Bowl run where he felt like there was a really extremely strong, different level of Colin that he didn't see before. So those things were very interesting for me to essentially to hear from him. And then also I wanted to kind of discuss with him his thoughts about how the protests affected their locker room and how they kind of eventually were able to go and do that. So he said that for him the biggest thing was reporters were coming in after the game, and they were losing a lot of games. So it was really something where they didn't want to answer these questions at this point, but that was what the narrative had become. So I think he said, like, at the time, he probably didn't really have a opinion about Kaepernick's protest. He just knew that it was impacting the team as far as having to answer these questions. But at this point, he was very clear and said he supports Colin Kaepernick. And he said that he really got an understanding throughout the years of what Colin Kaepernick was protesting for, what he was trying to draw attention to, as he continues to see some of these cases of police brutality and some of these cases of social injustice in the news, and he felt like that was a job. And he shared a story with me that I'm going to share with you guys, and then we'll kind of move on. He said the day that Colin Kaepernick finally decided to I guess take a knee, Kaepernick came in with the Black Panther shirt for the old black activist group, and he had it I guess hanging up on his locker, like players hang up their shirts they're going to wear after the game on the locker. So he wore it coming in, and then he hung it up. And Kilgore comes in there. I guess he's trying to break the ice and have a little fun. and I guess he comes up to him and he says in the Forrest Gump voice, let me get the exact way he said it. He came in with the Forrest Gump shirt and said, "Sorry to ruin your Black Panther party," and he said Colin Kaepernick kind of laughed at that, and that broke a lot of attention. But they didn't know that he was going to eventually go upon this protest and created all these waves. But he said that he ended up texting Colin Kaepernick after that day and pretty much essentially asking him, how are you doing, man? Everybody's slandering your name through this process. Are you okay? And Kaepernick essentially said, "Yeah, I'm good, man. How are you? How are you feeling?" Blah, 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 and flipped the conversation on him and was caring about what Kilgore had to say. So he felt like that was a really good example of what Colin Kaepernick's personality was, what his leadership style, what his friendship was. And then I guess a week later, Colin Kaepernick's girlfriend Nessa had asked him if any of his teammates had reached out to him after the protest, and he said, "Yeah, the white guy did," and he pointed to Kilgore. Kilgore is like, "Yeah, it was me." So I thought that was really kind of a fun perspective from him. I think he's a guy that is from East Tennessee, and he kind of told me that when he goes back home, he may speak to his people, and people aren't a fan of Colin Kaepernick, and they mispronounce his name, and they talk about how he's not he's a multimillionaire, he shouldn't care, or he's not impacted by these issues. But he felt like he really got a great understanding of why Colin Kaepernick is fighting through this mission. So that's a little bit of kind of our conversation. I thought it was really intriguing to hear that perspective from his voice, because he's a guy who obviously hasn't protested, hasn't been in the forefront of this movie, but is impacted by it. So he opened up for me. We had about a 15-20 minute talk, and it was really informative. And then I guess just today you came out, Colin Kaepernick and his team came out with statements from his agent saying, we want to play. These are some of the misconceptions that have come out about Colin Kaepernick over the years, and we want to kind of make these right. And essentially, he hasn't been offered a job. He works out every day. He wants to play. There's no salary demand. Some of these things. So I felt like this story was, and this kind of conversation was important to share in light of those new details. So if you guys have any questions on that, I'll be happy to answer. But I definitely want to move along a little bit to more football topics, because I know that's why some of you guys joined the chat. So next up, the Winless Bowl. I've never covered anything like this in my journalism career, first of all. I've had people, hit me up on social media, texting me, calling me like, "Man, I feel bad for you covering this game and this team. Like, how do you do it?" And I always tell people the same thing, like, I'm blessed enough to cover football for a living. So, like, good football, bad football, it's better than getting a real job. We always say that in the journalism world. So, I'm actually excited to see how this works out, because I think that, the old cliche is you'd rather be your team really, really good or really, really bad. And I think that, this team is really, really bad, obviously. So you go about it and you try to figure out what are different angles you can tell this story about. You tell it from the draft perspective. Do you tell it from, how do fans think about these things? Do you tell it from the front office perspectives? And I think it's all sort of, the way you make it and the way you go about your job. And I've got a question here from Omar Kelly, who covers the team with me out here with the Sun Sentinel, about how do you cover a winless team. And I'm learning on the fly, but I think for me is you try to put yourself in the fans' shoes, the people you're writing for. And like for me, it's a national audience, but I still try to speak as if I'm trying to hit the core Dolphins fans too. And I want to know, like, okay, what are people talking about? They're talking about, okay, what does this mean for Tua? What does this mean for their winless, their ability to get the number 1 overall pick? What does this mean for Josh Rosen? So I kind of look at things from that lens and less about, maybe game plan and, who's going to win this matchup on Sunday, like you may have done in previous years. Like I've written very little, like, okay, this week they're playing Washington. How are they going to, defend Terry McLaurin, who's their starting receiver? Like, I can't, there's no interest in that, because the Dolphins, their winning ways are put on hold. So I've written a lot earlier draft stories than I normally do. I've written a lot about quarterback, which I normally do, but written a lot about it from the long-term lens, not just about 2019, because 2019 in the grand scheme of things is not super significant for the Dolphins. And I've written a lot about sort of the psyche of, players inside the locker room. And I think that's an important element that we don't always see, because you have players who are impacted by all this losing. So although from the front office perspective, it makes sense for you to lose to get this draft pick and, complete this rebuild, how does it impact players? How does all the losing, kind of impact the people who have to put their bodies on the line and go to the job every day? So I think that perspective is really intriguing to me, because, every single player has a different story and a different perspective. I told this story here, I think a few weeks ago, but Vince Beagle, the Saints linebacker who was traded a week before the season, team that was a Super Bowl contender, to the worst team in the league, and he was pumped because he gets more playing time, he gets the opportunity. He might not be in the league right now, and he gets a chance to make defensive plays on a regular basis. But then there's also guys like Minka Fitzpatrick, who probably would have been really good this year on a star level, ascending like we thought he was if he wasn't on a tanking team. But because of his situation, he has to fill a lot of different holes. He doesn't feel like he's getting a lot of the direction and positioning that he needs to do, and then he asks for a trade. You got a guy like Xavier Howard, who's a star player, a top 50 player in this league, a top 3 cornerback in this league, who I start to wonder, like, does some of his techniques and some of his, his patterns of playing football get affected by all this losing? Because just naturally, if you go to games and you play to win the game and you're not going to win, maybe your energy level wanes. Maybe you don't do a lot of the stuff that you would normally do. So all of these kind of things are intriguing to me, and I think that's kind of storylines that take a new life in this tank or processing, so to speak. So I think that's, for me, how to cover a winless team. And particularly when you talk about this winless bowl, you've got two teams who are, for lack of a better word, have been immersed in chaos this year. Because, from Washington's perspective, they fired a head coach. They have a rookie quarterback that they drafted 15th overall, who was supposed to be their future, who, there's been reports that the coaching staff doesn't like. Or, and now there's probably a rift between ownership and how to make it work with him. And all of those different elements of how Washington's dealing with things. And then you've got the Dolphins, who are clearly trying to just figure out how to play together as a young group. And Josh Rosen's out there trying to destroy the tank on his own because he wants to win this job. And you've got guys like Daniel Kilgore, who says, I don't give a damn about a first round pick, I'm playing for now. So I think all of those different angles make it interesting. And for me, I'd rather cover that than 5-11, 6-10 team who doesn't really have anything interesting other than they're playing hard and they're not good enough to win. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to how I approach this winless bowl, how I approach the winless season, and how I approach like a really bad team that's purposely bad. So I think it's unique. I would want to do it every year. After this year, I'm hoping that this team takes a different trajectory, but it's a different experience. And it's, I'm riding the wave just like everybody else is. So I want to go ahead and discuss a little bit about Josh Rosen and the Tua craze. And then I'll open it up for any more questions. And after that, I'll go ahead and bounce and let everybody go watch some football. So Dean and Engon says people hating on players who won't give up. I'll talk about this topic like really briefly, and then I'll get to Rosen and Tua. It's interesting for me. Like, I grew up a football fan. I'm still a football fan, but like, I think there's a large contingent of the Dolphins fan base who root for them to lose. And we kind of had a debate in the media workroom today about essentially what percentage of fans are rooting for the Dolphins to lose on a weekly basis versus, what percentage of fans are rooting for them to win no matter what, even though the plan's going on. And I would say that the higher percentage of people who want them to win every Sunday are people who pay their money and go to games. I don't know what that percentage is, but I think that people who pay their money to go to games, no matter what the situation is, no matter if they agree with the tank or not, they want to see their team win. I think that's how I would approach it. Like, even if I was my team, my favorite household team was really bad, I would want them to win on Sunday. I'd love for them to get a high pick, but I'd love for them to win at least not get embarrassed. And I think that there's a lot of Dolphins fans who are kind of on the fence because it's weird to them. They're like, should I go all in on this guy? Because he looks really good in college and Tua. And it would be dope, and it would be different than something we've had over the last 2 decades where we've been mired in mediocrity. Or should I do my natural instinct and root for them to beat the Jets or the Bills, all these rivals that I hate? So yeah, I think that later in the season I may do something particularly just on the fan and how that's kind of a new world for them. But I think that the biggest thing is that I want fans to know, and that I think players want fans to know, is that they're not trying to lose every Sunday. They're going in and playing every week trying to win. And if they end up winning a game, I would be really, really set aback if fans got upset with players for doing what their job is to win. It's their role to play every Sunday and fight, put the good film on tape. If they end up winning the game, then they shouldn't be criticized for it. They shouldn't be hated on it. I saw Jerome Baker and Dale Cooper got a lot of backlash from their comments this week saying they don't care about draft picks. Draft picks are brought in to replace the players who are currently on the team. Why would players want that? So I just think there's a lot of different perspectives in this that I hope people kind of see for different angles. So real briefly, Josh Rosen kind of reiterated some of the comments that he said earlier when he first got to Miami, that, hey, I think this is a one-year tryout for me. I've got 12 games left. I want to prove to Mr. Greer, which is what he said, Chris Greer, Brian Flores, and the guys upstairs that I can be the guy. Now, I'm going to be frank. I don't think Josh Rosen has, a very significant chance to prove them wrong no matter how well he plays. I'd say maybe 5% chance for him to somehow prove that, hey, I deserve at least another year of evaluation to prove that I can be the guy. I think the Dolphins have made up their mind that they're going to draft a quarterback in 2020, and Josh Rosen is in a rough situation once again where the most likely scenario in my mind is that he's either a backup quarterback to start next year, or he pushes enough on the field for another team to trade for him and either give him the starting job or let him compete for it. So I think these 12 games are more of an addition for the other 31 teams in the Dolphins. And, I would love to see him play well. Obviously the Dolphins don't want him to, play well enough where they lose their pick and they still don't think he's the answer. But I think it would be in the Dolphins' best interest. It would be in Josh Rosen's best interest for him to play really well down the stretch. So I'm pumped that he actually said that. The one thing I will say about Josh Rosen, no matter what you think about him on the field, is that he's brutally honest. He's staying true to who he is, and he's not afraid to kind of tell you what he's thinking. He admitted this week that he hears the Tua craze, that everybody wants Tua, and he tries not to think about it a lot, but he hears it. And I think that's something that a lot of other players will say, hey, no, I don't know what you're talking about, which is BS. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. People always ask me what's my thoughts on Tua, and I'm going to end with this and call this a wrap for this session. Actually, I have one more question about, let me see. Somebody's asking, is Kenny Stills Albert Wilson going to take a knee for Hong Kong? I want to talk briefly about that, but in a different lens. But essentially, my thoughts on Tua is that I think he's a really good quarterback, QB1 for me. I don't think he's a savior. I don't think he's God, and I think you need a lot of pieces around him before they can be contenders. Real briefly on the Hong Kong situation, because we talked about other politics issues earlier in this chat. I think the situation with the NBA and Hong Kong is very interesting because clearly there's a monetary factor in there, and there's a lot of onus on athletes to speak up regardless. So do athletes owe it to the public or the press to speak up on issues if they're going to be known as sort of a vocal activist on any issue? Do they have to speak up on all issues? And it's sort of a burden question. What onus should we put on players? And I think it's really intriguing because I think that it's part of the pressures of using your voice. So me personally, I'm not knowledgeable about the Hong Kong situation. So I looked up into it and I kind of found some of the situations about China and what their government is like and why there's issues there. And now I have a little bit better understanding. But the old thought process is that you don't talk about stuff that you're not super knowledgeable about. That being said, I think that some players maybe use it as a cop-out because it's very easy to kind of educate yourself, at least on the bare minimum of that, to give somewhat of an answer. But the risk may outweigh the reward for some players. So I guess someone was asking, I think probably hand and foot kind of, will Kenny Stills and Albert Wilson kneel for Hong Kong? I think for Albert Wilson and Kenny Stills, they're kneeling from a perspective of a black man who sees people in their community affected on a daily basis by these issues. So for them, it's personal, and for them, it's personal for the people in their community. So no, I don't think so. But that being said, if a NFL player this week decided to kneel, of a Chinese heritage, or a player who feels strongly about this decided to kneel in support of Hong Kong, I think that we as a community should treat him with the same respect that I hope that we treated some of these other players protesting. So I think all issues that are protested should be treated with the same ilk. So I guess that kind of answers your question a little bit and my thoughts on there. As always, thanks guys for joining me. We try to do these every week and give you a little different spice inside the locker room, like Daniel Kilgore conversation earlier today. Last week we talked about sports journalism, and we'll continue to have these throughout the year. So as always, you guys drive what we were talking about. So hit me up on Twitter, hit me up on Facebook, hit me up on my website, CameronWolfe.net, where I post all of my Howling with the Wolf chats and have a little bit about myself on there. And I'll see you guys next week. Thanks.